Alright, here's the 10 meter pulpit for the last time before it gets gel coated. So I've done all the structural work, and it doesn't look like much, but I spent a lot of time in this pulpit to get this back to some reasonable structural integrity. And most of that work was down here on the end where the pulpit bolts to the boat. And I did a couple things, couple upgrades in the process. Every hole that you see here, and there's a lot in a pulpit because everything gets bolted into it. Everything's been filled, epoxied, and over drilled. And the other thing I did too was the original anchor bolts for the pulpit, I think, were a little undersized. So let me hold these up. So I upgraded to a bigger bolt, which you can see here, and a bigger head as well. So it'll have a little more surface area to bite down onto. And that's these four here. A couple of holes that are no longer going to be used I just have filled. Ignore that. That's just a structural build of epoxy. My windlass sits on top of that, and there was a pretty good gap from when this thing was compressed. So I just used that. That'll be covered up and hidden. So this will all look really good when it's done, and you probably recall in the first video this thing was a wet mess. So it should be good for a long time, especially the way I've got everything sealed up. On the top side, right there is where I did a lot of work. That's where the core was wet. I mean, the core still is wet here, unfortunately. There's just no way to get to the middle of this to clean it out. So a lot of what you see here is that was my attempt to actually split this thing in half and get in there and recore it, and I just couldn't do it. So I'll show you when I'm all done. I'll run the moisture meter around it, and there's still some high readings. It's not going to get any worse. It's completely sealed now, so I don't expect any issues. I was able to fix. That was actually a split. That was the wettest part of it. It was completely opened up. So I fixed that. And that's pretty much it as far as the top side. The only other thing I guess I should point out, which is no minor task, I was able to salvage the teak. The way the teak was installed on the pulpit from the factory was some sort of waxy paper, which was put down with 4200, I'm guessing 4200 or something like that, just strips of adhesive, and then this kind of paper layer. On top of that was 1/4-inch plywood, which was completely rotted, and then on top of that was the teak and holly, which I have over here, which I refinished, did a couple of coats here, and then once I get it all back together I'll put 2 or 3 coats. But I had to chisel away all the old plywood, which was glued to the back of this. I spent a lot of time. I probably should have just thrown this in the garbage and started over with new teak and holly, but the work's already done, and it didn't cost me anything to speak of. So that'll be the last step. I'll get that back together before I mount it back on the boat. And then on the underside here, which is how this all started, you saw in the other video, this is a combination of 1/2-inch plywood and 1/4-inch balsa coring. And so about half of what you see here is the plywood where it bolts down to the boat, this part. So that big lag bolt that I showed you up top goes through the plywood here, and I've got that completely encapsulated in epoxy. And then the forward half, which was originally the balsa on top of the underside of the pulpit, and then had the skin on top, and then was glassed in. What I wound up doing was just using this piece of glass here, the skin that I cut out, and the front half of this is just complete epoxy, completely filled with epoxy. So I thickened it up and I poured it in till it overflowed. So this is 1/2-inch plywood, and where all the balsa was is just solid glass now. And that should be good for the life of the boat. As long as everything's sealed, which it is, I think I've eliminated all the points of entry into the core of the pulpit. The only fasteners I'm going to have here, I was trying to figure out a way to do this. I'm going to use starboard here instead of the plywood. Put the teak on top of that. That'll eliminate that rotting. But I need some kind of mechanical fasteners, so all the screws that were in the teak, which went through the plywood and back into the pulpit, I'm going to reuse those. I'll seal all those holes. They're small, but those will be the only ones that I can't actually have filled with epoxy and drilled out. Everything else, though, is set. So I'll shoot one more video when it's all gel coated and looking good, back together and back on the boat.